Welcome to ACC Nation, featuring sports news and special guest interviews. Here's Will Ojanen and Jim Quist.
This is ACC Nation's Syracuse football preview with the lead football writer for Syracuse.com and the Post-Standard. He's a frequent contributor on the podcast Syracuse Sports. Here to take a look at the 2024 version of the Orange is our special guest, Emily Leiker. Emily, thank you for joining us. Long time no see. Hope you're doing okay.
Yeah, thanks for having me back again this year, you guys.
Always a pleasure for us. We get to talk about not only football, but a lot of other things that we all have in common. So we'll talk about one word in particular a little later that you used before we got on the program. Will, let's get into some football and see what's going on at Syracuse.
Well, there's one thing. There's a lot going on. Obviously, we have a new coach in Fran Brown, and we'll just start there because I feel like he's never coached at the college level as a head coach, that is, but he's obviously upgraded the talent a lot, and just kind of just getting the sense of how things have gone. It feels like the optimism level at Syracuse has been as high as it's been in quite some time.
Oh, for sure. Certainly, like the energy around the program entering this season is just completely different than the past two seasons I've covered, those last two being under Dino Babers, obviously. Fran came into the mix late on the Syracuse job, or at least came into public perception of what the mix was late. Like it was like a Thursday or Friday, I think, when we first kind of started hearing rumbles of his name. And by the following Monday night, it was that's going to be the guy who gets the job. And that was about 2 weeks after Dino had been fired at that point. And so yeah, like you said, he doesn't have head coaching experience, but he has kind of made this national name for himself as a really good recruiter. And certainly so far, like that's what we've seen from him. I mean, both coming in and kind of dominating the transfer portal right away, obviously picking up Kyle McCord, which was huge, picking up Fidel Diggs from Texas A&M, bunch of other guys. And then also like at the high school level, he managed to flip some guys in about 2 weeks before that early signing period, signed one of Syracuse's highest rated classes in a while. And then also, like, we don't necessarily consider it recruiting, but he recruited back a bunch of the top players on this team. Like, this team really didn't lose any of last year's leading contributors who weren't being forced out by their age. Like, Justin Barron's back, Marlo Wax is back. Those are the two guys who have been the biggest names on this defense for the past 2 years. And so, yeah, I mean, Fran has done everything right, I think, up until this point, especially when it comes to personnel. He hired a great staff. And so, yeah, fans are really excited. Players, I think, are sounding more optimistic to us than they ever have since I've been here. And so, yeah, I mean, obviously we have to wait and see how the games go, but things are looking up for Syracuse football, I think.
Definitely. And we'll start with another new coach. Obviously, I had a new offensive coordinator, Jeff Nixon, he's kind of been around the block. He's been dabbled in the NFL and college. I think he's been around for about 25 years. So what do you expect what kind of offense do you expect to see out of this team now?
Yeah, we've heard Nixon will run a pro style offense, which kind of makes sense coming directly from the NFL. He was just running backs coach with the Giants. And so I mean, a lot of ground and pound, and then also like hitting through the air and capitalizing on Kyle McCord's arm. We haven't heard like too much, but beyond just it's going to be pro style. Like there hasn't been a lot of like, this is what we're going to do specifically. Obviously, right, guys, coaches rarely get into that because they don't want you to know. So that is still something I think we'll get a better picture of hopefully in fall camp, but honestly, maybe not until week one. But pro style has been the descriptor. So of course that's going to be a little bit of a change. I think just knowing the differences between Kyle McCord and Garrett Schrader, who was the quarterback the past 2 years, I think the passing game will be a lot more consistent. We won't see as many QB scrambles, as many RPOs maybe as we did with Garrett, who often would just take off out of the pocket and carry the ball himself for better or worse. He had an extensive injury list kind of during his collegiate career. But yeah, the tagline right now is it's going to be a pro style offense from Jeff Nixon.
Coaches doing what they do best, keeping everything close to the vest.
Yes.
So Kyle McCord, Do you think a less stressful situation going from Columbus to Syracuse would be more beneficial for him?
Yeah, it's interesting. This is something that, the talk around Syracuse recently, at least from like the fan base, has been like, oh, why isn't Kyle McCord getting any respect? What Kyle's so disrespected by the national media. And like my coworker and I were talking about this today, like we don't that's like not really the case. Like he landed on the Maxwell Award watch list, which is one of the most prestigious watch lists and awards in the country. Like Phil Steele has him as the number 9 best available to be drafted quarterback in the next year. Like he is getting recognition in certain places. I just think it's not as much it's not as much as Syracuse people think it should be or Syracuse fans think it should be. And like certainly I do think there are places he's being undervalued or doubted just off of one season, really his only season as a starting quarterback, which is a thing to talk about as well. But I do think having it be a little lower stakes environment might be good for him. I think the other really big thing that we've heard from him and a lot of the guys here is that he's really familiar with a lot of these guys on this team because he's from New Jersey. Like half of this roster is from New Jersey. Fran Brown is from New Jersey. He knows Jeff Nixon. Like this is a team that he's really, really comfortable with personnel wise, despite it being his first year and probably only year here. So I think that makes the scenario really interesting for Kyle.
How was Aronde Gadsden coming off his Lisfranc injury?
Yeah, he I haven't seen him like going through full practice yet, right? In the spring he came back a little bit, but then they pulled him so that he could get the screws out of his foot and then he kind of sat the rest of spring. I talked to him the other day though and he says he's feeling good. He said there hasn't really been any of like the mental blocks yet that you would worry might come with an injury like that. His coaches, we got to talk to Michael Johnson, who's the co-offensive coordinator and tight ends coach at an event a couple of weeks ago, and he said OG's got him bigger, got him stronger through his rehab, and so he kind of just handled it as business as usual, and like he didn't go and like do a bunch of extra like recovery or re-strengthening programs or anything like that while he was off. So we'll see this week. They start practice on Thursday. Exactly like speed wise what he's back up to. But I mean, everything we've heard in the recent weeks and days has said that he's back to where he should be.
So who's another receiver you think could be a big contributor this year? Because I know they took a couple people out of the portal to kind of fill in spots too, but who's someone we need to know?
I'll throw out two names. Yazid Haynes, who is a younger guy who transferred from Georgia. He was touted really early on in spring camp and it's really, really fast. Like he is an incredibly fast guy. He's probably the fastest on the team. And he has really good hands as well. Like I don't think we saw him drop a ball all of spring camp. Obviously, controlled environment, like stuff like that changes in games, but he is a guy that I think will make early impressions and be a pretty flashy player for Syracuse this year in terms of receptions. And then the other guy who we haven't seen yet because he came in after that spring transfer portal window, but has kind of a lot of hype just around him, and I'm looking forward to seeing this fall is Justice Ross Simmons from Colorado State. He was their number 2 wide receiver, and he's actually a local guy. He's from Rochester, so he's coming back to the area, which is, I mean, another big thing that Fran Brown has done since he's been here is kind of bring back recruiting in the state and getting guys who are from New York to stay in New York. And so those are the 2 wide receivers that I think will make early impressions. But the whole core has expanded a lot and I think grown a lot in the past 6-9 months, however long it's been since Fran's gotten here. So they certainly have a lot more weapons than I think they have in recent seasons.
And another one we haven't mentioned yet is the running back LaQuint Allen, who was a really good dual back, was a great runner over 1,000 yards, was a really good pass catcher as well. Fortunately, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of proven depth behind him.
Yeah. LaQuint's going to be the number 1 back for sure. I think everyone's kind of expecting him to have another 1,000-yard rushing season. He's matured a lot, honestly. I mean, he's been here since my first season here. So he's one of those, he's in that class that I've kind of gotten to follow his whole career so far. And he's definitely grown up a lot since that freshman season when he kind of had his breakout at the end of the year in the Pinstripe Bowl against Minnesota. But yeah, behind LeQuint, it's interesting. So they had a few guys, lost almost all of them in the transfer portal. Um, Brought in freshman Yassine Willis, who will be a true freshman. He is big. I don't think I've ever seen an 18-year-old who's not a lineman that big. Like this is a big 18-year-old running back. He's taller than LeQuint. He's just got this build that's honestly a little bit reminiscent of Sean Tucker. He's taller than Sean was, but to draw a Syracuse comparison there. So Yassine's in that room. A lot of people are excited by him. And then they just brought in Will Nixon, Jeff Nixon's son, through the transfer portal from Washington. He was Washington's number 2 guy last year, so he got some reps in their national championship run, but didn't play a ton. So yeah, I think those will be the 2 guys that shuffle carries behind LeQuint a little bit, but they're going to be leaning on LeQuint mainly in the running game this fall.
And before I kick it over to Jim, I just kind of looked up his measurables while you were talking, and I'm like, wow, a freshman listed at 226 pounds at running back. Wow.
Yeah. You stand next to him and he's big.
Yeah. Jim?
Good stuff. It's good to hear that. I always like to focus on the guys in the trenches, Emily. And so let's talk a little bit about that and how important it is, because in the past, it's always been a struggle for Syracuse. And over the last couple of years, especially under Dino Babers, it just bringing in big guys, and smart guys, and having some level of depth and experience that would continue from year to year. Give us your view of what you're seeing here, and if there's anything going on with the transfer portal or recruiting, which is moving in the right direction with Fran Brown. Because I tell you, everything you've said about Fran so far tells me this guy is on top of the game, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, the trenches are certainly 2 places like that he very much focused on coming in, and right, like you said, these have historically been problems for Syracuse. I'll start with the O-line because that's the one everyone always likes to be worried about when it comes to the Orange. And I do think they're in a better place. They did bring in some transfers. I think probably the most notable is Savion Washington, who was on the Colorado line last year. Now, I know the Colorado line caught some flack from their own coach last year for not always being great, but Washington was consistently kind of the highest graded among them, and he battled an injury throughout the season while doing that. So signs point to him being promising as long as he's fully healthy this fall. And then I think the big thing too is they return. Last year, they only really had one returning starter on the O-line, which was Chris Bleich. And then they had a lot of like young guys, not necessarily young by their class, but just young and experienced. And they return a lot of those guys, and they did a lot of work with them in the weight room and strength and conditioning to, I think, kind of hopefully fix any injury issues or like prevent injury issues with that group. And so the front 5 or 6, 7 guys that they'll rotate through, I think, are really solid. And I do think there is a better group coming up behind them, or at least a like deeper group coming up behind them than Syracuse has had in a little bit. I'll say the other thing we've heard about the O-line in the past week or so when I was at ACC kickoff is they're like the position group who's been putting in the most extra practice time this summer. Fadil Diggs, who is across from them on the defensive line, he was like, yeah, they've been putting in like 30 to 45 minutes of extra work after we go through walkthroughs and captain's practices. And Kyle McCord added that they're in the weight room and doing this different things. So certainly like that's not something I've heard about the O-line here before. So to even hear that they are taking those steps and seemingly understanding that they could be a linchpin to how successful this team is this year, I think that's a big step forward. So that's kind of the O-line. I don't know if you want me to touch on the D-line now or throw it back to you.
Just a second. Because I want to take that O line and sort of go backward for a moment with Kyle McCord.
Mm-hmm.
Is he a pocket passer sort of guy predominantly, or is he sort of that dual threat? I want to get that picture and then wrap it around that O line.
Yeah, he's predominantly been a pocket passer. And so like one of the things last year was that, right, when he didn't have any pressure on him, he was very accurate. Like he's a highly accurate passer, but the second he gets any sort of pressure on him in the pocket, things start to kind of implode. And he wasn't a good rushing quarterback last year. I think he finished with like negative 65 yards. Granted, he did have some ankle issues going on and stuff like that. So yeah, he has very much been a pocket passer. And so kind of from the day that he was added here, it's been okay, if they're gonna have Kyle just sit back there, they need an O line that's gonna give him time to be able to do that and not make him kind of forced to make his passes.
Yeah, that creates a much clearer picture for me in seeing what direction overall that offense may be taking. I can't predict anything. Don't have a crystal ball for it. But from the standpoint of moving into that next line, let's let Will take you down into the defense and we'll start there.
Yeah, so before I do, I'm just going to bring this up. A new defensive coordinator, Elijah Robinson, coming in from A&M. Kind of like with the offense, are they kind of keeping what they're running defensively kind of close to the vest as well?
Yeah, they like to throw out the big coach speak words, right? Like, oh, well, we're gonna be violent up front, and we're gonna push people around and stuff like that. So, I mean, what I can tell you is they're switching back to a 4-2-5, which is obviously right the more common kind of defensive scheme than the 3-3-5 that Syracuse had been running the past few years. So there will be 4 down linemen up at the front, which I think will change how a lot of that looks for Syracuse. But yeah, it's been a lot of we're going to be violent on defense and we're going to force people to make mistakes and stuff like that.
Gotcha. So obviously now with the four going mostly with a four-man front, how they obviously need more bodies up front. How did they address that?
Yeah, I mean, Fidel Diggs, who I've mentioned a couple times now, he was the big pickup. They have added a few other guys. Michael Nwokocha, who is a 6'5" guy who out of a JUCO in Texas. They return quite a few guys as well. I'm running through my roster here. There's so many new names. I think they added up to like 40 new players on this roster this year. So it's been a lot of name management on my end. But Diggs is certainly the biggest one for them, and he will play on that kind of edge rushing outside position. And yeah, I mean, Diggs is the big addition for the D line. And it's kind of all the same as the offensive line thing. And honestly, what they did for the whole program is they put them on better diets, better nutrition. They fixed the strength and conditioning program, which had been something we heard wasn't great here at Syracuse before. And they got all these guys to like lean out if they needed to, or put on more muscle if they needed to, and did all this stuff. And so, like, even the guys who are returning, who maybe people have been kind of dubious about in the past, it just feels like they're completely different players entering this fall.
So with the linebackers, you mentioned Marlowe Wax a little bit ago as someone who returned, and he was a really, really good linebacker for the Orange last season. What about the rest of the linebacker room? Who's coming back and who's new?
Yeah, playing across from Marlowe is likely going to be Derek McDonald, who started most of last season. Those two, I think, have a great kind of working rapport together and line up well. Behind them, it gets a little iffy, just in terms of like who exactly will be the number 2. They have some younger guys. David Omopariola is a name in there. Zian Moultrie Goddard is, I think, one who might come up a little more. Anwar Sparrow is kind of the older in that pack. He has had some playing time, but he's also had some injury issues. He would still probably be my pick for probably be second behind Marlowe or Derek for sure. But Marlowe and Derek are going to be the 2. And, it's interesting with the new kind of format. One thing I'll say too, tie into the linebackers, is that Justin Barron, who's technically a defensive back and a safety, the star position he's playing now brings him down towards those linebackers a little bit more, and he's going to be doing a little bit more work in there. So you'll see him, I think, rushing a little bit more, getting down and trying to make some tackles around the line.
So let's say the secondary wasn't that great last year, but it seems like they really addressed a lot of those holes in the portal. What are names we need to know?
The big one is they brought back Deuce Chestnut, which was a surprise. And I know there are a lot of Syracuse fans who can't quite believe that he came back to Syracuse. He was, I believe, an All-American freshman his first year here, which was the year before I arrived, and then spent 2 seasons here and went down to LSU. He had some injury issues last year, which is why he ended up not playing very much with the Tigers. And then Fran Brown, I mean, he's a New Jersey guy. He brought him back up here. And so Chestnut played cornerback before, but what's interesting is Fran's moved him to safety. So he's going to be playing alongside Justin Barron and then Elijah Clark, who's also returning and was consistently one of Syracuse's highest graded defensive players last year. So the three of them will kind of be in those safety positions. And then on the outside, there's Jaden Bellamy, who's a returner. He was on the depth chart last year. Marcellus Barnes Jr., he is the true freshman who we think will probably get the most playing time. I don't think he's going to start on the outside at corner, but he'll be on the depth chart likely. We saw him get a lot of playing time in the spring. Devin Grant is another transfer name that's in there. He's from Buffalo. James Hurd from West Virginia is kind of in that mix between the linebacker and secondary group. So yeah, particularly on the outsides at corners, they had to do a little bit of work because they did have some returning guys in at safety. But I think they did enough to address it for this fall.
Let's get into the schedule, because this is a very interesting schedule, to say the least. And I think it affords the Orange a great start to the season. And it seems like everybody basically has a really nice start, and then it's like they hit a brick wall. But let's talk about the front end, and then we'll get into the back end and see whether there's a brick wall there or not. What do you see happening with Syracuse as they start the season and their schedule?
Yeah, I think certainly the first 5 games for them are all winnable. They start with Ohio, which is definitely a winnable game at home. Georgia Tech, I think, of the first 5 games is probably the most intriguing to me. I think they had a pretty good season last year, and they return a lot of those guys who were weapons. They beat Syracuse to guarantee that Dino Babers was being outed near the end of the season. So Georgia Tech will be an interesting one. Of course, Syracuse gets the advantage there. They're at home. We're projecting that those early games will probably be sellouts or close to, just because of the fanfare around Fran Brown so far from the fan base. Stanford at home on a Friday night, newcomer to the ACC, so maybe a little unpredictable there, but certainly wasn't great last season. I think Syracuse can handle them. Holy Cross, that's the FCS game, which is going to be super easy. And then they do make the trip out to UNLV to kind of cap that first 5-week stand. And that's their first West Coast trip of the season. So that should be interesting. I don't think I'd say that I'm worried about that game or anything, but that's probably the second. If I'm ranking those first 5 games in difficulty, it's like Georgia Tech, UNLV, and then kind of everyone else, and then Holy Cross at the bottom.
Yeah.
Wow. No love for the Crusaders.
I know.
Not to disparage Holy Cross. I mean, but just be realistic. As we get into the wall and the latter portion of this season, it sets the front end, sets the team up for the potential of getting into a bowl without too much of an issue, I think, for the most part. The back end may not help them so much, and it's going to be more challenging. What do you see in the back half of this season?
Yeah, well, I'll talk about who isn't there first, which is the big reason this schedule has kind of presented as easy for Syracuse.
Yeah.
right? I mean, no Clemson, no FSU, no UNC. Like those are the three teams who particularly ravaged Syracuse last season in October, back to back to back, and have just in general the past few years kind of been the harbingers of doom for Syracuse football season. So missing out on those three, I think, is very nice for Syracuse. But there is difficult teams there in that back half. Particularly, I mean, you get NC State and Virginia Tech within a couple weeks of each other. NC State on the road, which I think definitely adds a layer of difficulty going down and playing at Carter Finley. I have both NC State and Virginia Tech as like kind of dark horses in the conference this year. Like, I don't know that they'll necessarily make the championship game, but they're going to be contenders up there. They're going to be teams that you're hearing about. I think both of them could be top 25 teams for a good amount of the season. So those are certainly two of the interesting ones. Pitt and BC, those two annual rivalry games for Syracuse. I think this year Syracuse should feel pretty secure in those games. Going down to Pittsburgh, Syracuse always seems to have a little bit of trouble, which is interesting. I don't know if it's just an in their head thing or what, but that could be the wrench there. Obviously Pittsburgh did not have the season they wanted last year, and I don't know that they're going to make a huge comeback this year. We'll see. We'll see what the Panthers put together. And then you close out with West Coast trip to Cal. Cal's one of those teams in the ACC this year that I like. No matter how much I read about them, I feel like I don't have a read on like who they're gonna be, like what's gonna happen.
Right.
Like especially too, like being a newcomer to the conference, it's just kind of like I don't know. So it's nice a little bit that they get them late in the season, I think, and hopefully we'll have a better picture of how this team is operating in a new league. UConn could be a trap game, but I think it will be. And then they close with Miami, which I think will be obviously. I think no matter what, that's an interesting game, but could be a very, very important game depending on where each of those teams is respectively. Because like Miami's another one of those teams that I think is more than a dark horse for the conference. I think they're up there in that conversation in the top three. And so that could be a game that Miami really needs to win to take home the conference win and solidify a championship berth, or maybe it's Syracuse just kind of knocking around and trying to get one last for themselves.
Interesting. All right. Will, any last questions?
Yeah, I guess one real quick. Are you ever going to get used to Cal and Stanford being in the ACC?
No, probably not. I mean, I was saying to someone at kickoff last week, I was like, even seeing all the branding on all the posters, it doesn't feel quite real. Like, I don't know if maybe making that trip out to Cal will, or like something that when Stanford comes here, but it's certainly interesting. And that's, I mean, even looking at the other conferences too, like I was filling out my AP preseason ballot today and I was like, oh, like this school is in this conference now. Like I need to check who they're going to play this season and all of that. And so, yeah, new world we're living in now.
A lot more to come too, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Our
Yeah.
ACC Nation Syracuse football preview with the lead football reporter for Syracuse.com and the Post Standard, Emily Leiker. Thank you so much, Emily, for joining us and giving us a preview of what's to come for the Orange and for Orange fans.
Thanks for listening to ACC Nation. Be sure to listen, like and subscribe to our podcast, radio, and YouTube channels by visiting accnation.net. Follow us on Instagram, X, Facebook, Mastodon, Threads, Blue Sky and Reddit at ACC Nation.
ACC Nation.